This is Book TV's Afterwards podcast. This week a conversation with Chris Hughes, author of the book Fair Shot, Rethinking Inequality and How We Earn. He's interviewed by Representative Don Beyer, a Democrat from Virginia. This interview from our archives took place in 2018.
Welcome to this wonderful book discussion. Thank you for joining Chris Hughes and me. Let me jump right in. Chris, you talk about, quote, the power of unrestricted cash transfers to transform the lives of people. I know you came to this slowly but surely, but every time I ask others about this idea, they say, why should we trust people? Won't this make them dependent and lazy? How do you answer that from your own experience?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to having a conversation today on this very important topic. I think, I wrote the book to make the case for unconditional cash but I wanted to ground it in my own personal experience. So I grew up in a small town in North Carolina called Hickory, North Carolina. It was at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains, and my mom was a public school teacher. My dad was a traveling paper salesman, and we had a very stable middle-class existence. And in my own life, I got financial aid to go to a fancy boarding school, then on to Harvard, where we started Facebook in 2004, and the rocket ship rise of Facebook, is a pretty well-known story. But in my own case, I ended up making quite a bit of money at a young age, and it forced me to think about, well, what is the most powerful way we can help rebalance the economy so that the 0.1% who keeps getting so lucky is actually not getting lucky at the expense of everybody else. And so that took me on a long journey of looking at what is the most powerful way to help people get ahead. And it turns out the evidence is pretty clear on this point, that if you provide people with cash, unconditional cash, no strings attached, then they invest it in themselves, in their families, in their communities. Their kids do better in school. Their health outcomes are better. They work just as much, if not more. So I think to answer your question, the reason to empower people with cash is not only to make the moral case that we can wipe out poverty with it, but also the pragmatic one, that people want to invest in themselves, and there's no more efficient way to do that than providing people with the cash to do so.
Chris, what do you say to the skeptics who will argue they'll just spend more money on tobacco or alcohol? Is there any research to support that or oppose that?
Well, we actually know a lot about what people do when they get cash, when they have an opportunity to invest in themselves. So there's quite a lot of studies that show that providing people with the resources, more often than not, they invest in themselves and their families. There will always be one or two people out of 100 who don't use the money in a way that many people would deem responsible. But on balance, people don't spend more money on alcohol. They don't smoke anymore. In fact, the opposite happens. When they're able to have a little bit more financial stability, there's every reason to believe that people eat healthier, that they invest in their families, that their health outcomes improve. And so I think when people ask the question about, well, isn't everybody just going to spend the money on booze and cigarettes, really they're asking a question that's fundamentally about trust. And it's a question about really what we consider to be the right thing to do, the right way to help the poor in particular. And there's a sense that we should just build more government programs, that we should build more regulations to tell people to do this or that with the money. When in reality, if we can just ground ourselves in the data and challenge some of those fundamental assumptions, then I think we would do well to use cash to invest in people. And by the way, this is not just a sort of left-right kind of issue. Specifically, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is the world's largest cash program, and it's the size of $70 billion here in the United States, has been supported by people on the left and the right, despite concerns about, well, do people really use this money effectively? And it's because there's an immense amount of evidence to show that people are responsible with the money when they're provided it. and that it's the most efficient way to lift people out of poverty and provide economic opportunity. Every president since Gerald Ford, Republican and Democrat alike, has meaningfully invested in expanding the earned income tax credit. And so I think there's a good case to be made that there should be bipartisan appeal on the issue.
Well, Chris, wasn't this earned income tax credit originally a Milton Friedman idea among the most conservative of economists?
Yeah, the EITC came out of actually the last big debate that we had around a guaranteed income in the United States. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, it was widely accepted on the left and the right that a guaranteed income could be the most powerful way to ensure that no one lived in poverty in America, and the most efficient way economically to provide economic opportunity. So Milton Friedman, who was an early proponent of the idea, talked about it and wrote about it extensively in that era, at the same time as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was making the same case, more from a moral perspective, but at the same moment in history. Richard Nixon, as I'm sure you know, supported the idea of a guaranteed income, and it even passed the House. It eventually failed in the Senate, and if you will, went underground for several decades. But the earned income tax credit was one of the policies that came out of that. So it was a kind of stepping stone, if you will, to that over time has been expanded and expanded again and again because it has been effective. So now I think we have a new moment, a new opportunity to talk about the changing nature of work in the United States, to talk about poverty and economic mobility in this moment when income inequality is at historic levels. And we would do well to ground that conversation in a conversation about how cash can be the most powerful way to combat the inequality and provide the economic opportunity.
Chris, how do you address the irony that Mick Mulvaney, head of the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, has suggested that on food stamps, instead of making food stamps relatively unrestricted, we should ship people boxed meals? Is this not moving exactly the wrong direction from your unrestricted cash transfers?
I think that I agree. I think that would be a move in the wrong direction. I think that, ironically, that kind of outlook that would drive somebody to design a boxed meal rather than providing people with cash is a kind of paternalistic view of government, which ironically on the right, many people, particularly on the libertarian right, have been skeptical of for a very long time. And so any kinds of movements to tell people what to spend the money on, or even to these cynical moves to tie a lot of the benefits that exist today to work requirements as a way to throw people off of the rolls, I think are moving in the exact wrong direction. But I think it's part of a pattern of economic thinking that comes from this administration, which is more focused on doubling down on debunked trickle-down economics, which over the past 40 years have created record profits for companies, but kept median wages flat while the cost of living has increased. Instead of working on that problem, they're doubling down on that theory, and corporations today are very happy about it. I mean, the stock market is near record highs, and it's my view that may feel good to some in the short term, but it's a sugar high. It is going to, that bubble is going to burst. And what's more, it's just from an ethical perspective, the idea that we should be cutting rates on corporations and telling poor people specifically what they should be eating, both of those things just seem fundamentally out of line with where the country is today politically and the long-term values that we want to share, the values of respecting the dignity of everyone to make their own choices, their freedom to be the masters of their own destiny, and the responsibility that I think we all have to ensure that no one in America in 2018 lives in poverty.
Yes, some have described it as socialism for the rich and market capitalism for the poor. So tell me, so the original proposal in your book was $500 per month for families making less than $50,000 a year. So $6,000 a year. How many people would be lifted out of poverty through this? How many people would receive payments? What's the overall structure look like?
Well, where we want to go in the long term is an income floor that ensures nobody in America lives in poverty. So a lot of people talk about a universal basic income these days as that big idea. And there's lots of different ways to slice and dice it to interpret the idea in a robust debate about how it might work. I'm very focused on the income inequality that exists today and what we can do right now to create a first major step towards the eradication of poverty and the restoration of opportunity for the middle class. So, in my view, we can build on and expand what we know works to take the Earned Income Tax Credit, significantly expand it in size, and make it flat so it's easy to understand, so that everybody who makes less than $50,000 in the United States and is working in some way for their families or their communities benefits from an income floor of $500 a month, every month, per adult. On this order of magnitude of a benefit is big and would be expensive. You know, it's about half of what the cost of defense is today. But it would lift 20 million people out of poverty overnight and stabilize the lives of 90 million Americans who very much need not only a boost to their bottom lines, but the kind of stability of being able to count on the $500 a month in the background. So it is I think, a powerful way to begin the work to establish an income floor that in the long term could potentially be even bigger. But in the here and now today, to me, this is a place that we don't have to worry about, or we don't need to talk about whether the robots are coming for all the jobs in 2030. We know that this kind of policy could be massively impactful in the here and now.
Talk a little bit about the philosophical idea that the poor know best how to solve their own problems, rather than government.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense in the country, particularly actually among elites, on the left and the right, that we the experts can engineer the progress that we want to see. And I became pretty skeptical of that idea myself. And the way that I became skeptical of it was actually from the perspective of philanthropy to begin. So after Facebook went public in 2012, my husband and I made a commitment to give away the vast majority of our wealth over the course of our lifetimes. And in taking on that challenge, we began to look at all the different nonprofits that were out there doing good work. And specifically, I was looking at economic opportunity in that period internationally. And I have a whole chapter in the book that relates a journey that I went on over the course of several years, but specifically highlighting a couple moments in that journey in the book, where I spent time with one nonprofit that was working in Africa to try to engineer progress. So this idea was that if we could just invest enough in education and in healthcare and in roads, sanitation, fertilizer, agricultural training, I mean, just all of these different benefits, and build all of this administration and bureaucracy around a small village, then all of a sudden we could lift everyone out of extreme poverty. And I went on a trip to go visit one of those villages and became pretty skeptical pretty fast. We went on a walk, and this was in a village called Durtu on the Kenya and Somalia border. And we went into some dormitories that had been recently built to house students. And there wasn't really anything in the dormitories. No sheets on the beds and pencils, books, the kinds of things that you would expect kids to have. And it felt a little wrong. And so I asked, and I said, oh, well, we just cleaned it up beforehand. We went to the health clinic, And it, too, was very clean, very orderly, as if no one was using it. Later, we went and they showed me the computer, because I'm the, in theory, the tech guy who is there to be impressed by the connection to the internet. And you ask the teacher, well, what do you use it for? And he was like, everything. And there was little specificity. It turns out that a journalist, later chronicled the story in this particular village. Those computers had never been used. They were later stolen. And the villagers themselves were not able or willing or interested to take advantage of so many of these opportunities, and eventually even petitioned the Kenyan government to push out the nonprofit that was administering this. And so I mention this story because it's indicative of this idea that we can just engineer progress. And that is in direct contrast to the idea that we can use cash to enable the beneficiaries themselves to choose what they want and to invest in themselves to create their own lives, to create their own stories. And so another nonprofit that I got involved with and later went on the board of, Give Directly, took a very different approach. Provided cash unconditionally, no strings attached, and what's more, an independent group ran a random controlled trial to measure the exact impact of that cash. Did it get wasted? Was it used productively? And they found results that are in line with hundreds of other studies, which show that dollar for dollar, cash is one of the most, if not the most effective policy that's out there. So I think in the United States context right now, there's a big question about, who do we trust more or who should we invest in at this moment in time? More complex government programs that lecture the poor on how to spend their money, how to behave, etc., or the poor and many in the middle class too, who haven't gotten a raise in decades and who we know, when provided with cash, invest in themselves and their families. And this is a big debate. I don't want to oversimplify it or say that it's a small one. This is a big debate that goes to the core of who we want to be as a country. But I think it's time that we have a conversation that puts the emphasis on what we know already about how people use money and brings more people to the place where they feel that they can trust in one another and trust in other Americans to be the masters of their own destiny.
Chris, in your book, I was fascinated by the examples you pointed out around the world, people that are trying this. But there is one really close to home. There's a state that has had a unrestricted cash transfer for a while. Which state, and how's that worked out?
Well, up in Alaska, they have a small kind of guaranteed income. And the story behind the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend is in some ways an unexpected one. So a Republican governor back in the 70s, when Alaska was enjoying a huge amount of economic abundance, if you will, decided that he would place a small royalty on oil and gas companies, and they would pay a few percentage points of their profits into a common fund every year. And that fund would distribute 2.5% in dividend checks to every single Alaskan, man, woman, and child. The idea was put up for a referendum in Alaska and passed overwhelmingly. And so for the past 30 plus years, every Alaskan, 700,000 Americans, has benefited from a permanent fund dividend check. It's about $1,500 every year, comes in October. And if you're a family of four, I mean, you're getting a check for $6,000 every fall, which is a meaningful amount of money. It's not so much money that people can hang out and put up their feet and, play video games or drop out of the workforce. But it is enough money to help people make ends meet just a little bit more easily. So several of my colleagues and I were in Alaska last fall talking to people about what they do with the dividend, and the empirical research about what people do with it backs up many of the stories that we heard. It was people who were using it to cover a month or two of rent that they were behind on. Some folks were using it to prepare for the winter, buying heating fuel. Others were saving it for their college education, and then upper middle class and wealthy people were using it to fund a vacation in January or February when all the Alaskans want to go somewhere warm when it's pretty bleak and cold up there. But the biggest learning that I think we can take away from the permanent fund and how it's used is that not only do people love it because it provides them with a little bit of breathing room, it is also one of the most powerful factors to beat back against the poverty rate in the state of Alaska, to lower that rate significantly, and to contribute to the fact that Alaska is actually the most equal state in the United States of America. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from it. And by the way, the idea that people when you go to Alaska, this is not welfare, this is not a handout, this is something that each Alaskan benefits from and each Alaskan can use as they see fit. And so we know culturally that it's very much possible to create this income floor with this kind of security, have it be massively popular, and have it be massively effective. And I think it's a great provocation for, how could we create a kind of Alaska for America kind of program. I mean, Hillary Clinton talked specifically about evaluating that idea as part of her campaign in 2016. She did not end up advancing it, but in her book, she makes the case that it's one of a small set of ideas that she wished she'd thought more about because of the boldness of it and because of the power of it to combat poverty and provide mobility to the middle class.
And Chris, I would argue that it's not a small idea either. We struggle so much on Capitol Hill with how to overcome income inequality. We realize now that, as you write about in a winner-take-all economy, our income inequality is the largest it's been since before the market crash in 1929. We're moving very much in the wrong direction. And your Alaska example shows that this guaranteed income may be the single biggest step we can take towards creating income inequality without massive other changes in the structure. So thanks so much for pointing out that Alaska, of all places, is dead last or dead first in terms of its income equality rather than inequality.
I think that's right. And I think it's important to say that cash is not a silver bullet. I wouldn't want you or any of the viewers to think that I'm sitting here saying that cash is going to solve all of our problems. I think we need good schools. We need a healthcare system that provides accessibility to affordable healthcare to all Americans. We've got to think about smart skills building and training. There are many things that we need to do. However, I do think that we often jump to these systemic solutions first, and we miss that sometimes the best solution is the simplest. And so I think we would do well to think about cash and the creation of an income floor, of a kind of guaranteed income in America, in conjunction with a lot of these benefits, not instead of them. But I do truly believe that it could be the most powerful tool in the toolbox to accomplish many of the goals and that I think you and I share.
Chris, there are, in a book full of fascinating ideas, I want to read just from one on page 155, where you say that small amounts of regular cash reduce the feeling of living on the brink, which research unsurprisingly shows causes immense amounts of stress and poor decision making. And you talk about Rutger Bregman's TED Talk, that people aren't poor because they make bad decisions. They make bad decisions because they're poor. Can you expand on that idea?
Well, I think there's Rutgers speaks to this as you mentioned, but there's a whole body of psychological research which suggests that when people feel and live scarcity, when they're feeling like they're on the brink, there's a limited amount of resources and they don't know how they're going to be able to make ends meet, it makes them more stressed and depletes the cognitive function. So one specific study that is indicative of a whole set of others. It was done in a mall in New Jersey, and you ask people, what would you do if your car broke down? And the cost of repairing the car was going to be $300. So they asked these groups of people, wealthy people or middle class people and poor people, that question, and then immediately afterward had them each do an IQ test. And unsurprisingly, they had the same IQs even after being asked this question about, well, what would you do if your car broke down? You had $300 and it would cost $300 to fix it. Then immediately after they said, okay, well, what would you do if your car broke down and it cost $3,000 to fix it? And they then had each group take another IQ test. And what you saw is in that second scenario, the middle class people, the folks who had financial security, did just as well as they did 5-10 minutes before. The group that was living closer to the edge saw their IQ points drop by about 12 points, which, just to give some context for it, is about what you see. It's the level of an IQ drop that you see when you test people after they've pulled an all-nighter. And so what that demonstrates, the way that experiment has been interpreted, is that when you shift the cognitive outlook of someone from a place of financial security and you begin to ask people to think about, well, how are you going to be able to cover a kind of cost that you cannot cover? It introduces a whole level of stress, a whole level of distraction that when they then move on to other tasks, that doesn't just immediately go away. That very much stays in place. And so if we then zoom out and think about what's going on in America, we know that half of Americans can't find $400 in the case of an emergency, like a car breaking down or a healthcare emergency. Half of Americans, which is many people in the middle class, not just the poor, are literally, they're living on that brink. And, so when we talk about the stress that comes with that, there's a very real human cost, and there's also an economic cost, because those people are constantly thinking about how they're going to be able to make ends meet. So the power of a guaranteed income is not just to combat income inequality that, as you mentioned, is at record levels. It's also to create some semblance of stability. $500 a month that you know is going to arrive in your bank account every single month by a direct deposit or by a debit card, that you know that you can rely on. And that stability, I think, is as important, particularly with the changing nature of work and the rise of the gig economy, as the income inequality that the guaranteed income would also combat.
Chris, so we're talking about giving this to people who are working. What about folks that can't work because they're staying home taking care of an elderly, infirm parent, or they're raising kids, or they have a disabled brother or sister they're taking care of? How do you deal with those folks?
Well, I have my view on this. I have a whole chapter in the book dedicated to this. Is that we need to expand the definition of work that you and many other people in government use, and connect it to what everyday people already recognize as what work really is. So when we talk about work just conversationally, a young parent, a mom or a dad who's staying home with a young child who's and working to raise that family. Most Americans see that as work. Similarly, if you have an aging parent and you're involved in elder care and you're at home taking care of that parent, that is, in my view, work, and I think we call it that. Similarly, education. Students are working hard. They may not be getting paid for it, but they are workers in a broad sense of the term. So I think as long as you are doing something for your family or your community, you should not live in poverty. That's the fundamental value that a guaranteed income, I think, should support. But we need to really expand the definition of work. Now, there are still some people who won't fit that. For instance, the disabled or the elderly. And I think that is why the social safety net is so critical. And I had an uncle who was on disability benefits for much of his life. He could not have survived without Social Security disability. Those kinds of benefits, I think, need to be supported, reinforced, and expanded, and not cashed in to pay for any of the other guaranteed income. And it's, in fact, only when those things work in concert with one another can we create true security and financial stability for every single American. I think that's a key value of how the guaranteed income, I think, should work, and it's an important thing to note. I really very strongly believe that this should be additive and built on top of the existing benefits so that we can make sure that everyone in America is provided for.
I certainly know when our children were young and my wife was staying home taking care of them, she pointed out she was working much harder than when she was working out in the outside world. And the unfairness of the homemakers, the people who are rearing children, not having any Social Security contribution has just always really bugged me. I just look at the difference between what I get and what she gets at the end of our working careers, and it's very unfair and very different.
And it structurally disadvantages women and people of color, who are those who are most likely to be in those roles. So those are groups that we've often overlooked with social policy. And the idea that we have to ask a mother of kids to go leave her kids and take on all the child care expenses to go work at Burger King in order to qualify to be doing real work, in order to qualify for many benefits. I think that's dated, and I think that's indicative again of a kind of paternalistic state, prescribing behavior to people, when what we want more of is recognizing the work that's already happening and ensuring that we can make good on the promise that if you're doing something for your family or your community, you shouldn't live in poverty.
And Chris, I assume the numbers that you talked about, lifting 20 million people directly out of poverty, affecting, was it 60 million overall or 90 million overall, those include those homemakers, those caretakers, those students.
Yes.
And one of the fascinating statistics
Absolutely.
in your book was that black mothers have a 76% workforce participation rate, whereas white men only a 72%. It's sort of against the popular myths, at least, of who's working and who's putting out in society.
I think that there is this pervasive myth in the country of kind of quote unquote underclass of people who just want to hang out and don't want to work. And I think that's left over from the Reagan era, but I think we should also be clear that a lot of the conversation around welfare in the Clinton years, bought into that kind of frame, and I just think that's fundamentally wrong. The data shows, as you highlight, that workforce participation is actually lowest among white men, who historically we've viewed as being the hardworking folks who are headed out to the factories every day. But today, those are the folks who are working the least. And there are big questions about why that is, and I think a guaranteed income would invest in many of the folks who are suffering from the structural changes in our economy today. But it's so key for us to understand that the myth of the welfare queen that's out there is just that. It's a myth which works to reinforce certain biases and stereotypes about the poor, which has no basis in real data.
And Chris, there may not be any research on this yet, and I didn't see it directly addressed in your book. But we're all very familiar with the opioid crisis and the 60, 70,000 lives I think it took last year in America. It's the same folks that are living on the brink that seem to be most affected by the opioid crisis. Can you speculate about the positive impact a guaranteed income would have on this healthcare dilemma we're dealing with?
Well, I think that the opioid crisis is so complex because it has multiple causes and no clear magical solution. I think that's why, as a country and as a culture, we should spend all the more time paying attention to what's happening. I mean, when we think about what's causing it, the growth in prescription painkillers, some of the unfortunate innovations in drug delivery that came out of the past 15 decades, cell phones making it easy for people to access drugs more conveniently, and the fact that a lot of the country is suffering from deindustrialization, and that's particularly in many of the places that are the hardest hit by the opioid crisis. So I think that there are a lot of very smart people talking about what are the solutions to that problem. Everything from reforming prescription painkillers to substance abuse clinics, etc. I do also think that we need to provide economic opportunity to the individuals who want to work. Which is effectively, in my view, every American. And the issue is, in many of these communities where there is suffering from deindustrialization, the idea that people should just take care of themselves just doesn't line up with the lived experience on the ground. I'll give you one example. Last summer, I was in Ohio, and I was talking to a young woman who was the mother of a couple kids. She had a job in retail, and I asked many questions. One of which was, do you want to go back to get retrained for another job? And what she said to me is, by all means, of course. She's like, let's talk about how I'm going to do that. I said, okay. And she said the local community college where those classes are is 45 minutes away. This was just outside of Youngstown in Ohio, and the closest campus location was about 45 minutes away. The cost of the yearly tuition was $8,000. Now, she could get financial aid, and by her rough estimates, it would cost her about $1,000 to enroll for a year. Then we got onto the logistics of how she's going to be able to go to these classes. So classes meet every Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. or Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 7 p.m. But she has to get into a job where she's going to be able to tell her boss, I need off every Tuesday and Thursday morning, and I need you to schedule around me, which anybody who's familiar with scheduling, particularly in the low-wage retail sector, right now, workers don't even have any idea of how many hours they're going to get this week or next week, let alone specifically what days they're going to need to work. Then in addition to all of that, the costs of childcare to cover her children for when she's in class or in school, and the gas money to get there, and to get back, not to mention the lost wages from the time itself. I mean, the point isn't that there are so many barriers we should just give up, and she was just, totally stuck. The point is we can have the most incredible education system ever. We could have fantastic programs at that local community college. But if people don't have the basic foundation of financial stability to be able to pay a babysitter, to be able to have negotiating power to get into a job where there is some predictability around the shifts, to be able to afford the lost hours, then they're not able to take advantage of many of these opportunities. So I think it's so critical when we talk about all of the reasons that the opioid crisis has happened and all of the economic mobility solutions that many people spend a lot of time thinking about, that we don't lose sight of the fundamental lack of financial security that people need to be able to take advantage of many of those opportunities in the first place.
Chris, so far we've talked all about all the good this guaranteed income would do, but where does the money come from? How do we pay for this in a federal budget that's already very, very upside down?
Well, I think that there are a lot of ways to finance a guaranteed income. My view is that the clearest way is to ask those who have done the best in the new economy to pay their fair share, and that is people like me. So specifically to bring tax rates on income above $250,000 back up to where they were historically. That's at 50%. And close some of the most egregious loopholes in our tax code, like the Buffett rule, which enables billionaire investors like Warren Buffett to pay a lower tax rate than his executive assistant. If we do those two things, then I think they would bring not only balance back into the tax system overall, but they would raise enough revenue to be able to lift 20 million people out of poverty overnight. The tax rates of roughly that level are what we had for the decades following the Second World War, when we had immense economic growth, and that economic growth was broadly shared. We had broad-based prosperity. So this, for me, is not about pitchforks coming for the rich. It's about what we owe one another. I think we all should invest in an America to provide economic opportunity to all Americans. And what's happened right now in our economy, because of the way that we've structured it, it's just become egregiously unfair. And the gains are consistently going to the top 1% and to the top 0.1% rather to everyone else. So this is bringing it back into line. You mentioned the upside down tax code that we have. The cost of what I'm talking about over the next decade is just a little bit more than the cost of the Trump tax reform bill that was passed at the end of last year. So anybody who's out there who thinks, well, this is such a far-fetched idea, this is far too expensive, I think the question really is what are our priorities as a country? If it's so easy to, think about $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion tax cut on corporations, why can't we think about that when it comes to working people? In fact, I very much think that we should, and it is doable. It is expensive, to be clear, and I think it would be a very meaningful change in how the tax code is structured. But I think as the movement to repeal and replace last year's bill grows and we move into 2020, 2021, hopefully we can see opportunities to do something. I've
been very impressed with the idea that the people living in poverty, the people on the edge who would be the beneficiaries of this $500 a month, are likely to spend almost all of it. A very high marginal propensity to spend and to consume, whereas the people at the top, the top 1%, aren't. So you'd think that from a dynamic scoring perspective, the economy may grow more quickly more robustly with this program than without.
Well, there's some research that suggests exactly that. The Roosevelt Institute did a study last year that modeled out what would happen if we created a guaranteed income of about $500 for every American financed through progressive taxation. And what they found is that it would boost overall economic output, it would boost GDP by about 7% over the next 8 years. So nearly a point of extra GDP growth per year. And the reason that that wasn't all that surprising to a lot of economists was because of exactly what you mentioned. You know, you give an extra $500 to a family who's struggling to make ends meet. They're going to invest that money in housing, healthcare, childcare costs, whatever is the most urgent need that they have. You give a guy like me an extra $500, I'm going to put that in the bank.
Yeah.
I might spend a couple dollars of it, but it's not going to be used in the productive economy. And given that our economy is driven by consumer spending, for the most part, spurring consumer spending with this, with a guaranteed income, would create meaningful economic growth. And I think that it's worthwhile to say that anybody who thinks about the, how that would affect the wealthy with all the new taxes. I mean, that the economic growth is good for everybody. It's good for the middle class. It's good for the poor, and it's good for the wealthy as well.
And Chris, you put your finger on what is one of the more effective and true criticisms of the Trump tax reform, is that the R's were saying, hey, we're going to cut corporate tax rates from 39.7 or 35 down to 21. And it will cause the economy to grow faster. But in fact, what we see happening is they're spending more than 80% of that on stock buybacks and on dividends. So the money is going to exactly the people who aren't going to spend it. We're going to put it in the bank.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and it's this is the effects are pretty clear, even no matter your political approach. I mean, the Wall Street Journal has had a series of pieces covering that. The fact that the corporate tax cuts, at least thus far, aren't going into R&D, and outside of some symbolic small wage increases, do not seem to be, at least so far, going into raising wages. Instead, they're going into stock buybacks. They're going into dividends. And, a small group of Americans owns a lot of stock, and those are the folks who are benefiting disproportionately, and that's just going to reinforce the income inequality that we have, and make it worse.
And it's an old employer trick to you give your employee a $1,000 bonus, and then it's done. You don't have to worry about it next year, or the year after, the year after. It's not an ongoing thing. Mm-hmm. So, Chris, you laid out three principles for your guaranteed payment. One was regularity, that you get it every month. A second was this expanded definition of work, to include students and stay-at-home moms and dads, those who care for the elderly. But the third one was overcoming complexity. And I know one of the challenges we've had with earned income tax credit through the years is people don't know how to apply for it. They don't really know what it is. It sounds complicated. How do you address the complexity piece of this?
Well, I think it's a large issue with the current benefit structure. I was in Detroit last spring in a conversation about with folks who were struggling to make ends meet, and there was a moderator, and the facilitator asked the question, does any of you guys benefit from the earned income tax credit? And you go around the group, and people are a little confused. One woman raised her hands, everybody else was sort of quiet, and then the one of the criteria that the facilitator had used to bring the group together was income level of a certain amount. So the facilitator knew that several people in this group were very likely to be getting it. So then she asked the question again. She said, do any of you get a check in the spring, a couple months after you file your taxes, that that's a check that you can use for whatever you see fit? And then several people in the group said, oh yeah, I get that. And one woman in particular said, oh yeah, I got that last year. And she was a woman in her 20s. She had a couple kids at home. She was a waitress. She said, yeah, I got that check last year, and I thought it was wrong. So I called up the IRS, And I said, wait a second, you guys made a mistake. You sent me a check for, I don't remember the exact amount, but it was something like $1,500. And I just want to let you know, because I can't be like depositing this money in my account and then have you come back 6 months later and say, I need that because, you know, I got bills to pay and I will spend it. And they said, no. What this is actually the earned income tax credit, and you claimed it on your taxes, and, you know, it's your money to spend as you see fit. And she said, oh, okay. And she did. She bought school supplies for her kids. She paid a month's rent in advance, so she had a little bit more security, and she was good to go. But the follow-up question was, well, do you think that you'll get that next year? She said, I have no idea. And it's true that many people have no idea, because the current way it's structured, it depends on so many different factors. How much money you made this year, how many kids you have, whether or not you're married, what state you live in. There are so many different factors that it's not a predictable source of security. And as powerful as it is, I think a lot of the power of it, particularly of an expanded earned income tax credit, is in the stability and security of knowing that every month you're going to get $500 as long as you're working in some way to take care of your family or your community, and you're going to be able to rely on that consistently. It's a flat amount, so you know how much it is, and it comes every month like clockwork, and so thus you know that you can rely on it. So as we think about modernizing the earned income tax credit, I think the key is to adapt it to, unfortunately, the instability that has become synonymous with the modern economy for so many people, to make sure that it has the real effect that people want and need it to have.
So people won't need to apply for it. It will be more automatic based on their tax return from the previous year?
Well, I think that there are a lot of policy details, specifically like what's the form like. Right now, it's extremely complex, and we know all the sort of the most critical pieces of data already on the tax reform. So there is a way to simplify it. Another big policy detail is exactly how do you phase it out, right? Because with any social policy, you don't want to create some kind of cliff where, you know, people don't only want to make $49,999 and not go, you know, $1 over to lose it. So there are really important policy design decisions that that the experts that I worked with to inform a lot of the big picture design principles, I think are anxious to work on and dive deeper into this year, next year, and as the conversation around this grows. So we need to go even deeper with another level of specificity here, but these are the kinds of problems that we can figure out. I think the big challenge is developing really the political will to say we can be the generation that ends poverty in America, and we can use cash as the way to do it.
On the political will, do you have sponsors in the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House? Is there a champion yet for this plan?
Well, there's a lot of people interested, and we'd love it if you would, become one of the big supporters of it. But there's, I know that you've done a lot of work on similar economic issues. There are a lot of people who are intrigued. There are a lot of people who really understand the power of cash and the importance of stability. There are people like Congressman Ro Khanna, Senator Sherrod Brown, who are leading the way with a big proposal of expanding the earned income tax credit. However, we're seeing a lot of momentum a little bit closer to the in the levels of government that are a little bit closer to the lived experience of many struggling people. So, for instance, mayors. The mayor of Stockton, California is this young man named Michael Tubbs. He's 27 years old, the youngest mayor of a major American city in the United States. And Stockton is a challenged city. It's 300,000 people live there. It declared bankruptcy several years ago when it was under different leadership. And Michael Tubbs has decided that Stockton will be the first city to demonstrate the power of a guaranteed income. So the group that I co-run, the Economic Security Project, is working with him and with a group called the Stockton Demonstration to pilot the idea and to provide Stocktonians, a certain subset of Stocktonians, with a guaranteed income of about $500 a month for several years. And so I think that that's an important opportunity to bring more attention to the issue. Hopefully we'll get other cities who want to do similar things. And we can build the momentum so that there is a sense that this is doable, that it is a powerful solution. And as we move into 2020, when there'll be more of these conversations around what are the big ideas in our politics, what are the big ideas when it comes to income inequality, I very much hope that that the idea of a guaranteed income will be at the center of that debate.
Chris, we only have about 2 minutes left. I wanted to take a couple of seconds to read one paragraph from your book in which you quote Dr. King, who's in just a week or so we're going to remember the 50th anniversary of his death. And Dr. King wrote in his final book, "The dignity of the individual will flourish when the decisions concerning his life are in his own hands, when he has the assurance that his income is stable and certain, and when he knows that he has the means to seek self-improvement." It sounds like your book and your wonderful ideas here fulfill his vision very well.
Well, I was certainly inspired by the writings of Dr. King. I mean, in many ways, it's that passage that you read and many of his other speeches became a kind of almost scripture to me in this work over the past few years, because he talks extensively about how to do a guaranteed income, but at the end of the day, he is making a moral case. The case that no one in America should live in poverty, and that cash is the clearest way to respect the fundamental dignity of the individual and provide for her his freedom to figure out what kind of lives they want to lead. So Dr. King led on this, and in fact the sermon that he gave just before he was assassinated was on many of the Sunday before was on many of these same themes at the National Cathedral in Washington. The challenge, I will say though, is that when he wrote those words, 40 million Americans lived in poverty. And now, 50 years later, 40 million Americans live in poverty. And it's a stark reminder that the work that he began and led continues, and that we need as broad and diverse a coalition of people as possible to rise up to say, we are going to be the generation that takes this on, and that, for once and for all, ensures that no one in America lives in poverty. It's a big idea, and it may take another 50 years. I don't know. Hopefully it doesn't. But I think we have to all roll up our sleeves and work to continue that fight.
Chris Hughes, thank you very much for sharing many of the most important ideas in your book. You certainly have challenged us boldly to continue to fulfill the vision of the nation's founders, Dr. King, and many others. So all of you who are watching tonight, thank you for watching author, entrepreneur, philanthropist, and bold thinker Chris Hughes. Go buy his book and read it carefully so that we're all really in tune with the wonderful ideas he presents. So thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards. Please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts.